We are once again here to have a conversation we call attempted intelligence, and today we're talking about the value of the idea of constructs, right? So you and I have had a discussion already about this, and the concept of a construct seems somewhat confusing initially.
Yes.
Understandably. What does it mean to you at this point? Does it make some more... You probably feel like it makes more sense if you have a conversation and you're like, it makes more sense.
Yeah.
Are you able to put into words what you think a construct is?
I can attempt it.
Oh, please do. That's why
My main problem was looking...
What is it?
Okay.
You can tell me about your problems later.
Okay.
Tell me what a construct is.
It's the definition of a thing.
It's a definable
thing?
Right. Now, to define something, do you require categories?
To define something?
Yes. Do you require categories with which to describe it? Be they numbers, colors, sizes, shapes.
To describe it in its raw form, I believe you don't need a category to describe it?
No. Can you describe a picture without qualities or quantities?
No.
Can you describe a plant without qualities or quantities?
No.
Okay, so you need some form of categorization system.
Okay.
What is a categorization system? What's the fancy word for a categorization system? Or a classification system in science?
Ontology?
Yes. Okay. Ontology in philosophy is essentially the study of what's real, or the study of reality, right? And that gets really weird and whatever. But in science, it is a classification system. So a construct requires that a classification system has existed, or has been put in place to describe and define things to the point that they are able to be separated.
Okay.
So an ontology, being a classification system, is discriminatory by its very nature. You have, so as an example, say, hey dummy, or I say, hey dummy. Those are two separate things. Now, you could argue, well, they're the same because you said the same thing. Right? Well, no. I did say the same thing, so the words were the same, so the content was the same, so on that, they're the same. However, the manner in which I said it, like, hey dummy, versus, hey dummy.
So like your tone.
The tone, there you go, that's the classification, that's the other category, so it's content and tone. So on content, they look exactly the same.
Right.
So they look the same, therefore they are the same. But you know for sure they're different. You need another category to make sure that you understand that they're different, right? So you need to be able to take them apart. You need to be able to discriminate between the two.
And when you take those apart, they are now recognized as separate constructs.
So in this case, to be fairly gritty, the content is a construct, the tone is a construct, but in a united sense, there's the overall construct that both of them exist in. Like it gets dicey.
Right.
When you're really trying to get granular about it. However, so you could say that each measurable category or each definable category is a construct in and of itself, or you could say that you require multiple categories to create a construct or to identify a construct, right? So the idea of a construct is that things are definably different enough that we can identify them. As separate. Right now, they can occur at the exact same time. Right now, the reason I bring this up is primarily because of what drove my master's research. What drove my master's research was my experience of instructors that were not necessarily particularly nice to students, right? And thinking that impacted performance.
Okay.
My experience was, in front of me, students would do fine. So I knew these students were completely capable of performing. I would see them in a different combination in front of other people or some combination of people, and the performance that they displayed was not of the quality that I knew for sure they were capable of. So that led me to believe that being positive would improve performance.
Okay.
Right? Now, what I found was that it is not the demeanor of how something is delivered, it's the content. Right? Now, the content is extremely important because the content is what allows for learning.
Right.
Right? The actual content is what will drive the learning. The demeanor of delivery, it has an impact, it's just not on performance.
Okay.
Right? Or maybe on the capacity to learn and the capacity to perform.
Right.
Right? Now, I can say that if you're rough on somebody, they may not perform well in front of you. They're capable of performing, but it's entirely possible that that negativity accrued over time will make it more difficult for them to perform in front of you.
Right.
Right? Or in front of me, whomsoever is rough with them. So, the tough part is that I didn't understand, and if I considered it, what I would notice is that regardless of instructor, the marks looked the same, especially on written tests.
Okay.
So they had different instructors that treated them differently. There was different dynamics between a given instructor and a given student or a given group, whatever. There's all these weird dynamics that are not necessarily because one person's just mean, but there's just different dynamics, right? There's variation, but the marks just look the same. Couldn't tell them apart. Like statistically, you couldn't tell them apart.
Right.
So they all performed. When you look at larger data sets, what you identify, or what I understand that you identify, is that smart students do well on tests. Right? Doesn't matter the instructor.
Right.
That's it. Right? That's it. So what I had to come to understand was that content and delivery happen at the exact same time, but they're different constructs.
Oh.
I didn't understand that initially.
Right.
I had to go through a process of doing a thesis to figure that out. Now, the manner in which I ran my experiment doesn't mean that that's going to be the same all over in every place,
Right.
but it does show the value of understanding a construct, right? You're not going to understand it when you start. You're going to understand it when you figure it out,
Right.
or when you do something that shows you, oh, these are different things.
Right.
They happen at the same time.
So do constructs always, if there's multiple constructs, do they almost always happen at the same time as another construct?
No. Some things happen at completely different times. It's, night and day happen at different times. Unless you want to be really meta and be like, well, on Earth, night and day happen at the same time all the time. It's like, yeah, but not for me. Right? So it depends, sometimes it depends on the observer, right? Night and day do occur at the exact same time on Earth.
Yes.
But for Mark, night and day are separate times. It's gradations, though.
Right.
Right? And the clock, the standard 24-hour clock, is separated into certain chunks that we call morning, afternoon, evening, night. Right?
Right.
We chunk it up.
Right.
Because depending on where you are on the planet, the photocycle is different.
Yes.
Right. There are some places on the planet where the photocycle is very stable all year round, and then there are other places where it varies through the year.
Right.
Right. So it's like, well, when it's bright out, it's daytime. It's like, well, actually, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's what you feel like.
Right.
However, on the clock, so your experience of photocycles and the 24-hour cycle do not match up perfectly.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
That's another problem. That when you have multiple constructs, sometimes they don't overlap well. You feel like they should, but they don't. Right? If I told you being nice to students helps them, will help them learn and perform better, would you superficially almost immediately agree with me?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course you would. Or why wouldn't you? Like, what's being mean to them do? You're like, well, wait a minute. Think about, are you aware of some of the scandals in American female gymnastics?
What do you mean by scandals?
Like the general abuse that's happened to the top level athletes.
Yes.
Right, so there's a coach, Bella Caroli and his wife, I think her name was Marta. They produced champions. Absolute champions.
Yeah.
But to a female, they were almost always abused. On some level, psychologically, emotionally, physically.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think they got hit much, necessarily. And I don't believe the Carolis physically abused them. There was sexual abuse by a physician.
Right.
funny enough, it was an osteopathic physician. And the moment that I found out that that was an osteopathic physician and I heard some of the stories, first of all, he was creepy.
Yes.
100%. But he was doing what would be called internal work,
Mm-hmm.
right? So for the way that anatomy is laid out, there are some muscles in the pelvic floor,
Mm-hmm.
and there are some muscles that will control the hip, that there is access point by going into body orifices.
Right.
Right. And it is something that does occur under the name of osteopathy. I generally am not a fan of it.
Right.
I will never do it myself.
Right.
The challenge with this individual is that there is some... Have you heard of pelvic floor physiotherapy?
No.
There's a thing called pelvic floor physiotherapy,
Okay.
where it is properly codified. There are proper hygiene standards,
Right.
but they do intra-pelvic work.
Okay.
Whatever hole you have, they'll go in.
Right.
Right? This is agreed upon. I don't think that if you went there and all of a sudden it's like, what?
Right.
It's not out of the blue.
Right.
But it's well codified, right? Now, so there are arguments to be made for that type of work, right? The challenge with this particular individual is that Dr. Larry Nassar,
Yes.
he was doing it without gloves.
Right.
And just like,
But also
wasn't even washing up.
Yeah, but also not making them aware that it was like immediately. It was one of those things where he.
I lack enough information
Fair enough.
to understand if there was explanation prior. There were times when these young ladies' parents were in the room,
Yes.
right? So it's one of those gray areas where I know what the explanation could be. I disagree, but stuff happened,
Fair.
right? And I'm like, well, you didn't even wash your hands, man. What the hell? So yeah, it was creepy as hell.
Right.
But young female gymnasts in America, abuse victims,
Yes.
champions. So, in their development, so if you look at it, if you look at performance outcomes, do you have to be nice to them for them to be champions?
Clearly not.
And this is where it's tough, right? Because I deeply desired to be able to prove
Right.
that being nice to students helped their learning and performance. I wanted that. Couldn't find it.
Right.
Right? It didn't show impact. The being supportive or having or doing essentially nothing had no impact. Content had an impact. It's content alone.
And in your experiment, the content was the same, but the way that you treated.
No, there were two groups. So I had a supportive coaching with specific content group.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of how they performed, I said, "Awesome, fantastic, good job, wonderful." And then if they made a mistake, a particular type of mistake, I would coach that mistake.
Okay.
I identify what they did fine. I identified the challenge they had. I told them the difference. Then I have a supportive coaching group. So regardless of condition or regardless of performance, awesome, fantastic, good job, wonderful. Right. So being supportive in
Right.
between trials, but I wouldn't coach. I wouldn't give them the specific content, and then I have no coaching group. So just in between trials, we'll move to the next one.
Okay.
All right. Neutral demeanor. What it showed. So if the supportiveness did something, then the supportive groups with specific content or supportive only should look the same. And they should look different than the no coaching.
Right.
That's not what happened at all. What happened is the supportive coaching with specific content group looked different on a specific thing that I did not expect at all than the other two groups. So if they identified the appropriate physical phenomena, they found the right thing,
Right.
but they put it in the wrong category,
Oh.
I'd coach that.
Okay.
So they made less categorization errors. They all identified stuff, no problem, but they put it in the wrong category.
Okay.
Right, so this specific content group, they make the mistake of categorization, I'd coach it, and they'd fix it.
Oh.
The other groups could not fix it, they didn't know they made the mistake. They just didn't know they made a mistake, that's
Right.
all. So the constructs that I was working with happened to be supportiveness and specific content. Specific content wins. Right? So if you look at abusive gymnastics coaches,
Right.
it's the specific content. Right? And it's really annoying because they happen at the same time. So although these female gymnasts from America were champions, they were also abuse victims.
Yeah.
So the whole point for myself in talking about those two examples, my experiment and the gymnasts, is to essentially suggest that you can get the performance outcome right, with a specific content. And the abuse may not necessarily affect that, but it affects the person.
Right.
You can't pull them apart because they happen at the same time. So if you're consistently rough with learners and they consistently perform well, are you going to separate them? You're not going to separate them.
Yeah.
Because there's no observable proof that you're doing the wrong thing.
Because you're measuring performance.
And is an abuse victim going to tell their abuser that they're abusing them?
Most likely not.
Not often, right? There's a lot of abuse victims who it takes them years to be willing to speak up because they're often far enough away where they don't feel like they're going to pay the price from the abuser for talking about the abuse.
Right.
So the idea of, well, why didn't you say something when it was happening? Well, because I figured it would happen again and I did not want that.
Right.
So there's real weird stuff there where it doesn't look like what you think it looks like. But if you're rough with learners and they perform well, you're not going to separate the constructs because you think that that's the thing that's causing the success. That's all, because you can't tell the difference.
But just like you were saying with the individuals in the experiment, they don't know they're making a mistake.
No idea. They have no idea. And they're not presented with the evidence that they're making a mistake because the abuse victim is going to hide.
Right.
They're going to hide it. Right? Now, maybe abuse victim is a strong term, but rough treatment. Right? So if you treat people rough, they're not necessarily going to fight back. They're probably just going to turn away and move on, and they'll succeed, but they'll disconnect. Right? They won't stay engaged. They'll stay engaged enough that they complete. So they'll stay engaged enough that they can pass the test and get the hell out. Right? Their primary motivation is to get out, as opposed to please. Right? So because you can't separate constructs, you don't know that you're being rough on them. So the idea being these two separate constructs require two different measurements. You can't measure the impact of demeanor through performance measures. You need to measure it differently. So I need a completely different set of measurements to identify how did you feel when I said, "Hey, dummy," versus when I said, "Hey, dummy."
Right.
What's the difference between those things? There's a difference.
Yes.
Right? Between you and I, or whatever. However, we are very respectful of them.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So it's not So the deal is, because it's a different construct, I need to separate them and I need to measure them differently. Right?
So I'm just trying to understand when you have multiple constructs together, when you're looking at one, there's no way to gauge the other based on...
No, not on that measurement.
Okay.
You might feel like you are, but you're not. Right? So the standardized testing.
Yep.
So you could essentially have a grade or a scale, right? Like what's that thing? Spectrum.
Okay.
Spectrum. Right? A pool.
Range.
Range.
Okay.
Range or spectrum. So that you could say on one end is speed and on one end is power. Right? So how deeply can you think would be power, or how accurately can you think if given time, and speed is how accurate, like how can you answer these given a short period of time. They're two different things, right? But depending on the test you set up, you're testing more one than the other, right? You would also want to...
happen at the same time.
Well, no, it's a test. It's a testing situation. But if you minimize time and make them answer a bunch of questions, it's a speed test. Like how fast can they go, right? How fast can they get to recall, and then that's what you're doing. If you give them time but not a lot of questions that you need to really pull apart, then it's a power test. How deeply can you think? The idea being that they're separate constructs. So if you're measuring speed, but the thing that you're testing for, so let's just say you're testing a lawyer. Lawyers need to sit down with information, think deeply. So should they have a speed or a power test?
I'm assuming they need a power test.
They need a power test. That's not how they get tested. They get tested with speed. So that's the challenge, right? So you need to make sure that your measurement, your test and your measurement are for the right thing.
And when you say thing, do you mean construct?
Construct.
Just
right. Yeah, thank you. But if you're using the wrong construct, it's not particularly predictive. It's not going to show you what's going to go on. Okay. But yeah, you need to separate them out, be able to identify that. Now the problem is, in our own individual experience, there are many constructs occurring at the same time we're going to, for many reasons, zoom in on one. Right? Right? When we're speaking, are you paying attention to your feet? Like you are feeling your feet.
Oh yeah.
You're not paying attention to them.
I'm more aware of them when you mention it.
So at the same time, there's the construct of the exchange of sounds and the content of the words. So this is the funny thing. The sounds are obligate physical sensations. Does that make sense?
No.
You have no choice. If you can hear, and I make a sound, you have no choice but to experience the sound.
Okay.
If you do not understand English, do you understand the content?
Well, no.
No. If you do understand English, you experience the sound and the content, but which one do you pay more attention to?
The content.
Right? If you do not understand the particular language that's being spoken, what do you pay attention to?
It's just going to be sound.
But you're trying to translate the sound in some way,
Right.
but it's the sound.
So
You can't pay attention to the content because you don't know it.
mhm.
So they're happening at the same time, but they're different things.
That's really interesting because I've noticed a lot of people who do not understand a language focus on the tone that it sounds like it's coming from.
Yeah.
But some languages sound more intensely than others.
I believe the term is phoneme, sound which carries content.
Okay.
Right, so the sound intones meaning. So you have to be able to pair the sound and with the meaning.
Right.
So there's a translation thing in the
Right.
brain. Right, but that's, you have to be able to hear the sounds.
Right.
Because there are some languages that, if you don't understand them, they literally just sound like you experience them as just a range of sounds that
Yes.
happen to flow together. You can't differentiate them all at all
Right.
because you don't get it.
Right.
So you experience the obligate physical sensation with no sense of meaning. So there are two constructs, but you can only grab one
Right.
when you don't understand it. When you do understand it, there are two constructs, but you only grab one. Right? You're attentive to the content.
Right.
You experience the sound. You're attentive to the content. So they happen at the same time. They're difficult to pull apart.
Right.
Right? So to even have that discussion, you've never heard that before.
No.
What are you talking about? And now, are you paying attention to your feet?
Yes.
God damn it.
Well, because you mentioned it. Now
Yeah.
I'm thinking about it.
No, like in the now when I said it. or-
Okay. No. So when you said it, no. But after you said it, yes.
Okay. Yeah. But you need to focus your attention on the most important or the strongest stimuli.
Right.
That's what that is. The other constructs are happening. Can you feel your heart rate right now?
No.
Yeah, there you go. But you can feel your heart rate. You
Right.
are feeling your heart rate.
Right.
You're not attentive to it. It's the conscious level of comprehension or attentiveness.
Right.
So the idea is that many things are happening at the same time, but you are going to focus in on some. The ones that you focus in on will blind you to everything else.
Okay.
Right? And it's not that you're entirely blind to it, it's that at that moment you're paying attention to that thing. If you want to pay attention to multiple things, you have to set that up.
And you have to pull them apart. Or
Usually, at least consciously.
Just
in the way that cognition seems to work, yes.
okay.
Right? In an experiment, you can measure them at the same time, it's just different devices.
Right.
So,
Depends on which one you want
Yeah.
to focus on.
but
Right.
the idea of a construct being a defined thing. Now, just to touch back on ontology briefly, ontology being a classification system, when you have, say you have three categories to describe two separate things.
Okay.
And in those three categories, they look exactly the same. So, just as a singular category, the desert and the tundra have exceedingly similar amounts of precipitation per year.
Okay.
So if I only measured tundra and desert on precipitation, are they the same?
Yes.
But are they the same?
No.
You know they're not the same. So what do you have to do now?
You have to create another category.
Another category and describe each as itself within that category. Now what if that looks the same? Again, what do I need to do?
Do another one.
Another category. So in the creation of a classification system, in the creation of the categories of an ontology, you will notice two things: the similarities between things and the actual things that differentiate them.
All right.
Now, if you feel like you get to differentiation really fast, but you know that there's more richness, now you need more categories to essentially examine the richness.
Okay, so within an ontology as a classification system, are the subcategories constructs that we're trying to understand?
Yes, because they're measurable things. So it's a separate construct. However, they come together to create a united construct.
Right.
So the differentiator would be the place where maybe you need a different measurement.
Okay.
Right. So you might need a different measurement for each category, right? Which means it's a separate construct that can be measured,
Right.
but then the construct of desert
Right.
includes all those things.
Thanks.
Yeah. So there's an opportunity to unite it back.
Yeah.
You got to pull context out. But if I'm comparing two things, can I use one category for one thing and a different category for another thing, or do I have to use the same categories all the way down?
Well, you have to use the same categories all
All the way down.
because the things are going to be different. Well, seemingly differently at some point when you classify them.
So if we do that, have you ever considered comparing written work scientific? So if I ask you in English class, compare Huckleberry Finn and Moby Dick, is that science or is that literature?
Well,
Just think about it.
yeah, I feel like it would be closer to science. I don't know why.
It is. This is the thing. Most of the time, people are saying, well, these are classics, we compare them. But to compare them, you need categories.
Right.
You need to develop an ontology, and you have to ask the same question of each text and describe them on their own,
Right.
and then compare them. But in order to do that, you need an epistemology. You need a theory of reality, right? Is there one reality, or are there multiple realities? Because in the case of two literary works, there's two separate realities.
Yes.
They are their own things.
Right.
But I ask the same questions of them. I describe them on their own. That's the ontological step. So it's essentially constructivist, right? Because it also depends on the individual viewing the text,
Yeah.
right? So it's constructivist epistemology requires classification, right? And then the categories through which I view them, axiology, the values of the researcher. So English class is goddamn scientific. But most people let's use literature instead of English class. Literature the comparison is a scientific process.
Yes.
However, it is said it's art.
Right.
I'm like, oh, this is why you suckers don't like science.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Right.
It's absolutely everywhere. Does that help you understand the concept of constructs?
Much more now, yes.
Fantastic. Do you predict that in moment-to-moment life, because you know how we've had conversations where people are saying certain things, you're like, what is this?
Right.
Like, no, that's not what you're saying, these words, but that's not what you mean, right? Or you're upset in my general direction, but I have done none of the things that you're saying, right? So you're yelling at me, but I didn't do any of the things you're yelling about, right? So what's this really about? So it's two separate constructs.
Yes.
There's the yelling construct, well, not even two, it's the yelling, right? So my personal experience of being yelled in the direction of
the
content that I know that I didn't do, and then possibly the underlying motivation for the person to yell at you because they feel like you're safe to yell at.
Right.
I can yell at Mark because he won't punch me in the face. It's like, I won't punch you in the face because I really don't need to deal with the outcomes.
Right.
Like, whatever. But do you predict that you'll be able to better negotiate or think about those things now?
But just in general, to recognize them as they happen. Yeah, definitely.
Fantastic. There we go. Bottoms.